So, this is the second week of 4 that we are delving deeply into the practice of forgiveness. And we are doing that using kind of as a guidepost and as a text, the Book of Forgiving by Desmond and Umfo Tutu, which is based on the work that they did with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you're interested in purchasing the book, we still have some in our bookstore. And of course, you can always find it online, as many of us do these days. I don't think I can recommend a book more highly. It is truly well written. It's deeply touching. And, you know, even though it was written from the experience of a couple of black South Africans, there are things in there, whole paragraphs that Desmond writes that I could have written, particularly in his relationship with his father, who was a violent alcoholic. There were large patches of that book that felt like it was coming out of me instead of out of someone else. So it's very universal. They've taken the work that they've done and worked not only in South Africa, but in other places, other countries around the world. And it's a pretty universal way of dealing with forgiveness. So last Sunday, we talked about some of the things that forgiveness is and some of the things that it is not. And for anyone who wasn't here, I'll just kind of give you a quick catch-up. There are two simple truths that came out of that piece that we did, and they are essentially that there is nothing that cannot be forgiven. And that's worth us affirming together. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and there is no one who is undeserving of forgiveness. Let's affirm that. There is no one who is undeserving of forgiveness. Those are two very difficult truths, but they are true. And when we ask ourselves, but how? Well, we're going to start getting into that. So, Barry, if you would bring up the slide. We talked about this last week, but very quick review. This is essentially the way that either unforgiveness or forgiveness works. And it all begins with some kind of activating event. And if you can't read this in that box in the middle there, it says hurt, harm, loss. Those are the things that happen to us that make us need to forgive someone. And then those things, that hurt, that harm, that loss, leads to a pain in us. And at that point, we have a choice to make. And we can either go on to the revenge cycle, which is that circle on the left, that essentially means that we choose to harm someone. We reject our shared humanity with that person or those people. And we decide on revenge. We're going to retaliate. We're going to pay them back. And that leads us to some kind of act of violence or cruelty, which then hurts or harms those people, causes them to suffer a loss, and then they start their way through the cycle as well. And it goes on and on and on. However, at that choice point, when we're suffering from pain, from something's happened to us, we are able to then choose to heal. And that leads us into the fourfold path of forgiveness, which is telling the story, naming the hurt, and through recognizing our shared humanity, granting forgiveness to that other person, and finally choosing to renew or release the relationship. And it's obviously a very different path. It doesn't lead to more hurt, harm, and loss. It leads us outwards on into life. Now, obviously, we were probably going to suffer from a lot of hurts, harms, and losses in our lifetime, and we'll get the chance to forgive people on a regular basis, right? But we will not be going back and creating more hurt, more harm, and more pain in other people's lives. Now, the key thing to remember is at that choice point, it's not the trauma that we suffer that matters so much as the meaning that we make from it. Right? there are choices that we make even in the way that we think about things. Now, some of us have more deeply ingrained fears about certain things. If we suffer a particular loss or a particular event happens to us, it may just affect us more deeply. I don't like heights. Right? We have some people who actually choose to jump out of a perfectly functioning aircraft. If I were to be flung from a perfectly functioning aircraft, and that's what it would take, that would be a very traumatic event for me. All right? That would mess me up for a long, long time. So, yes, some of it may just kind of be in the way that we're plugged together. But even then, once that happened, I would still have the choice as I was falling through the air to scream my full head off or to attempt to, at least appreciate the horizon and the sky and the clouds that I'm falling through, and take a look at the sights, see what all those tiny people down there that I hope I don't run into at a high rate of speed are doing down there. It's very much about what we think about it and how we frame it. And in that moment, we have the choice. As I'm falling through the air, I can decide to forgive whoever it was that pushed me out of that aircraft, or I can decide to try to get back at them. And the honest truth is that the cycle of revenge never goes well. And what it does to me on the inside is probably the worst. That's the worst of all the things that happens. Because if I'm choosing revenge, it's making me a different kind of person than it would make me were I choosing to forgive and choosing to try to do some kind of healing out of that entire mess. So if I've decided, okay, I'm going to choose to let this go, I'm going to choose to forgive, where do we start? Well, according to what the Tutus have done and what they've proven works over quite a large population, first thing we have to do is tell our story. And I'd like to let Bishop Tutu say a little bit about that.
We have to start with the truth. Where I have been wronged, I must tell my story of the wrong that was inflicted on me. And if I was the perpetrator, again, I would have to acknowledge the wrong that I did and the harm that followed upon it. There really cannot be any question of forgiveness without the truth.
So it begins with the truth. And it's interesting, this idea that we need to get the story out, whether we're the one who's been harmed or whether we are the person who has done the harming. We are the perpetrator, as he said. It's an ancient practice. Any of you who grew up in the Catholic Church know what going to confession is all about. That has become, over the years for a lot of people, more of a ritual and less of what it was intended to be, which is actually a way of cleansing ourselves, of releasing those things by telling the story about them. In recovery, in the 12 steps, very similarly, we, as the step says, we admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. It is enormously freeing. And it works on both sides of the coin. It becomes necessary not only for us to say aloud those things that we have done, but for us also to say aloud those things that have happened to us. And there are a lot of reasons for doing that. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons is it helps our kids. There was a study done of children whose lives were impacted by the 9/11 tragedy. They followed these kids and their families for several years, mostly kids from in and around New York. And what they discovered was that the children who had been told more of the stories about their family's involvement and the things that had happened to the members of their family, even if they were really awful, the more resilient those kids were, and the better able they were to not only handle the outcomes of that, but the other things that kids have to handle when they're growing up. And that counts for us as well. When we really know our stories instead of just stuffing them down inside, when we are able to get them out, look at them, tell them, it enables us to not only be more resilient, but to go on and to heal. So the way this process works is we start with the facts. And as Bishop Tutu says in the Book of Forgiving, telling the facts of your story is the most important element of this first step. And it is how you begin to take back what was taken from you. Some of the things that happen when you tell your story, you no longer have to carry the burden of what happened alone. And I can tell you from my own experience in recovery that's one of the reasons that whole thing works, is that we all tell our stories and we also recognize ourselves in each other's stories. And we realize, hey, I'm not alone. I'm not the only person that this has happened to. So that then begs the question, well, who am I supposed to talk to about this? Who do I tell? And in an ideal world, as the Tutus say, as they did at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you would be able to confront the person that you need to forgive. You would be able to sit down with them and make peace with them. Even when that is possible, it's best to try to get that story out of you with someone who's going to be supportive and non-judgmental and loving and not fixing and all those other good things first. Because sometimes it's difficult just to get the words out the first time or two. Yeah, I was telling Laura on the way to church, I remember the Sunday after Robin Williams committed suicide, I began my talk with a quote from Winston Churchill. And I had read it several times, but I had not spoken the words aloud. And when I stood up here and I started to say, never give in. Never, 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 never. The words still bring me to an emotional place. And that Sunday, I almost couldn't get them out because it was the first time I'd spoken them aloud. So when you tell your story, the first time or two, even if you're going to get to confront whoever or whatever it was, tell it to someone that you can trust. Tell it to someone who loves you. If you do have the opportunity to confront that person that you need to forgive, you really need to decide before you try if they have reached a place where they're at least going to be receptive, because there's no reason for you to do this if they're not going to at least attempt to hear you. And you certainly don't do it if there's any possibility that they're going to do you more harm. Okay? So that's two big ifs there. If they're receptive, if they're not going to cause you more harm. All right? So when we say, well, gee, why do I have to do this? It's because the alternative is so damaging. When we don't bring these stories to light, they fester in us, and they have a way of coming out in ways that they damage us or they damage the people around us, and that is absolutely not what we want. So if you happen to be in the position where you need to tell your story, but it's not safe for you, to tell that person who has harmed you, or they're just not ever going to be receptive, write a letter to that person, even if you can't send it, even if you don't want to send it. Write them a letter anyway. And you can go out and bury it or burn it or whatever you feel like you need to do with it. But according to the Tutus, the healing can begin once the story is pulled from you. So, kind of to sum up the telling your story, remember you're going to speak the truth, as painful as it may be. You can start with the facts. Start with it simply saying, it was Thursday, whatever it may be. Tell your story first to a friend or a loved one, someone that you trust. Consider telling the story to the person that harmed you, and then accept that the story was what happened. Because that's really the key piece of telling the story, is being able to say, yes, this thing happened. So, once we tell the story of the facts that happened and say, yes, that thing happened, what we then have to do is own, and what did it do to me? And that's called naming the hurt. And that's the next piece in this. I had a video that I wanted to show you, but I'm a little short on time, and essentially it's a practice that the folks in forgiveness do, and it is singing the hurt. And if you go to forgivenesschallenge.com, which is where the Tutus have all this work stored, you can sign up for either the 7-day or the 30-day forgiveness challenge. There's no cost to it. You just give them your email address. And there's a lot of great exercises and a lot of great material. But the idea that you can sing your pain just simply by making sounds seemed very therapeutic and very helpful. One of the pieces that they get to that I find particularly important based on my work counseling people spiritually is that it is especially important to name the hurt when it is something that humiliates us. When our dignity is violated, as he says. It serves no one if we stuff the injury away in the closet of our disowned past. We do not need to succumb to the temptation to meet such a violation with retaliation. The only way to heal this hurt is to give voice to what heals us. And he goes on to say something I'm very familiar with from the rooms of recovery. We're only as sick as our secrets. We sometimes say only as sick as our darkest secrets. The single most important thing we can do at this phase is to share with someone else our pain, our grief, especially if it's something that we don't want to share. And that's the hard thing. It's those deep wounds. And they're the ones that can really fester and come out in a lot of other behaviors that do not serve us. He points out that this really is a place where we are served by the grieving process and by moving all the way through the grieving process. And if you're not remembering that, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And of course, it's not a straight line path through that. Often we're experiencing several of those things at the same time. And we do little, curly cues and circles, and we do the cha-cha, where, I thought that I got over that, but now I'm angry about it again, right? But in the beginning, denial actually helps us at a moment when we're not yet ready to accept the enormity of what may have happened to us. Denial is actually a tool that our brain uses to help keep us safe. But eventually we have to face what's happened. And once we move out of that phase of denial and we realize that person actually hurt me that way. That's going to make us angry. Sometimes people don't like being around us when we get angry. And that's a reason that many of us try to stuff our anger. We attempt not to experience it. And in unity, we always, we like to be all sweetness and light and positivity. And there's a place for anger. Now, we don't want to stay angry, but we need to allow ourselves to understand, yes, that happened, and boy, that was really not right, and I'm upset about that, before we can move on into the next phase, which is bargaining. And bargaining is, in a way, it's another form of denial. It's like saying, yeah, but this wouldn't have happened to me if. And I have a friend that I've been talking with recently who's working with a therapist. And they gave me permission to share this because it dovetails very nicely into what we're talking about. But that bargaining can sometimes take the form of trying to figure out why. Why did this happen? Maybe if I had done it this other way, that wouldn't have happened. It's a way of trying to take back control of a situation that we really don't have control over. So it's another way of, denying that thing, or of trying somehow to be in charge of something that we weren't really in charge of. The truth is that the why is that person did that thing. That's why. It wasn't our fault. And that acceptance of that can sometimes lead us to really realizing, wow, that thing really happened to me. And that's where we get into depression. When we finally give up the last pieces of bargaining and denial, we may get very depressed when we realize this is the new reality. This is me. This happened to me. And thankfully, once it sinks in, once we realize, yeah, this is the new me, and I'm still here. I'm still alive. I'm still kicking. We can finally get to that place of acceptance. And I love the way that he says this and how important it is to being able to forgive. Forgiveness and acceptance are essentially two sides of the same coin. Lily Tomlin said that forgiveness is finally giving up all hope of having a better past. And that's really what acceptance is. Acceptance is the recognition that things have changed and will never be what they were before. This is how we can find the truth, or the strength to journey on. We accept the truth of what happened. We accept our hurt, our anguish, our sadness, our anger, our shame, and in doing so, we accept our own vulnerability. That's where that, why and what if I'd have done things differently, that's why we have to get out of that. This recognition of our vulnerability is vital. There are only two choices when we're faced with a loss. We can put our hands on our hearts and accept our suffering, our vulnerability, and our human frailty, or we can reject this suffering, this vulnerability, this frailty, and raise our fists for revenge. So when we try to deny our feelings about whatever it was that happened, when we choose not to name our hurts, as he says, we always end up seeking destruction. And he says at some point in there that he honestly believes that every addiction, every alcoholic, every one of us that have walked that path did so because we buried some kind of pain and refused to look at it. And I would say in my own experience that's very true. The only way to stop the pain is to accept it. And I love the way he puts this. The hurt will always find expression, whether it is directed inward and causes you suffering or is directed outward and hurts those close to you. The hurt will not lie down. So the most important thing is to share your feelings with someone who will be able to receive them and do so without judgment. Will simply allow you to speak your hurt and to say what it actually meant. And we have to be able to feel. I know many of us numbed ourselves and tried to get rid of the ability to feel. It is absolutely imperative that we regain the ability to feel before we're going to be able to forgive. Those emotions that we have often lie below the level of our consciousness. But if we try to keep them stored down there, they will burst out in ways that will not serve us and will sometimes harm us and will cause harm to the people around us. But the more conversant and comfortable that we can be with our emotions, the richer our experience of life will be, and the more capable we will be of forgiving. So, remember that we want to create that container of facts when we tell our story, and then we identify our feelings with those facts. No feelings are wrong, bad, or invalid. Whatever you felt from what happened is what you felt, and it's okay. As you walk through this, remember that you are grieving something, and check and see that you're not stuck someplace in one of those stages of grief. Find someone you can trust who will listen and acknowledge your pain. And if you can't find anyone else, come find me. That's what I'm here for. Accept what happened and accept your vulnerability within that. And then when you're ready, move on. Next Sunday, we'll be talking about the next 2 steps in the fourfold path. And I hope you'll join us. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, for this time together, this time to learn, this time to grow our spirits, and this time to really explore what it means to forgive and how to do it, we give thanks. We are so grateful for the work that the Tutus have done, for people with whom we can share our stories and share our pain, and for the knowledge that in everything that happens in this life, we have a choice, and we can choose to forgive. Thank you, sweet Spirit. So it is.